Oh, good evening, guys, and thank you for the courtesy, George.
Sure.
Barry, let's see, I've got two quick ones here. The day of the execution, there are two contradictories in Luke 23:56 and Mark 16:1, which says, after the Sabbath was passed, they bought and prepared the spices. The other says they bought and prepared the spices and rested on the Sabbath, as was their custom. The customary Sabbath, of course, our Saturday. The execution would have taken place on a Wednesday afternoon. They had to hurry to get that body into the grave and get themselves washed so they could keep the first day of unleavened bread, the Passover. There are two Sabbaths that week, the high Sabbath on Thursday, the day of preparation of spices on Friday, and then going back to anoint the body on the Saturday afternoon. Get that 72 hours before sundown on Wednesday afternoon, the execution before sundown on the Sabbath on Saturday. The cornerstone of this whole thing is that crown of thorns. Unfortunately, Mel Gibson left out that cornerstone scene from his movie. Abraham went to Mount Moriah with his son Isaac to sacrifice him by orders of the Most High. When he got to the top of the mountain, of course, he bound up Isaac. Just before the knife was to cut his throat, a voice came from heaven, stopping the sacrifice. The voice then continued and said, Yahweh will provide the sacrifice. And he turned aside, and there was a ram, a male sheep, caught in a bramble bush. And that was the animal which was sacrificed as the substitute. And, of course, our substitute sacrifice coming out of the Torah is the Yahshua, the Jesus that we talk about. That crown of thorns came from that prophecy of the bramble bush, that history of the sacrifice. And that was, to me, an allegory and a signal to the Jews that this was the crown, this was the ram which he would provide in time future, and that crown of thorns being the unique, singular, unique part of that execution, crowning him with the same thorns found in that bramble bush, and the place of the execution planned with Isaac was on the same Mount Moriah in the middle of Jerusalem where the Messiah was executed. Like your comments.
Well, good, really good question. Goes in some areas way beyond my own skills and knowledge in that subject. Let me address the crown itself. You know, there are many depictions of a crown of thorns. It's a beautiful plated, woven kind of thing that fit nicely around Jesus' head. That's not what they did, though. That's not what the evidence on the shroud shows either. In my understanding, and again, I'm not a biblical scholar, so your knowledge in that area is well beyond mine, but my understanding was this, that this was a way of demeaning him by placing this, because he proclaimed himself the King of the Jews, so they gave him a crown, and it was a demeaning crown. It was just basically smashed onto his head, because the cuts that are on his head are all over the top of his head, not just in a circlet around his head as been depicted by artists. So, my knowledge is somewhat limited in the, as far as especially the New Testament gospel, obviously. But I wouldn't debate that part with you. I would just say that from what we can see on this cloth, these wounds on his head were there just because they smashed this down on his head. And a couple of scientists have picked out one of the plants that grows in that part of the world, and it has about 1.5 inch long thorns on it that were just strong and very powerful, and you know how easy it is when you cut your head, how much you bleed. His head was covered with these wounds. So it was not a gentle crown, but a really fierce smashing of this bush onto his head. But I wouldn't, as a matter of fact, I agree with you that it would have been a bush, and if that's a parallel to the thing that you mentioned in the Gospels, I wouldn't debate that with you at all, because they used some kind of a bush or tree of these thorns and smashed it onto his head as a crown.
Okay.
A follow-up comment?
Yeah, please.
The point I was trying to make was that the prophecy was the bramble bush in which this ram had been caught, and that was the substitute sacrifice provided for Abraham and his entire ancestry onto us. The very same place of that execution is the very same place that the Jesus of the Bible was executed, the very same geographical location to within a few feet. And the pressing down of those thorns, the ram caught in, very much a kind of a scrambled, brambled, not a uniquely plated thing. and then this very same kind of plating or non-plating of the crown that you mentioned that you see on the Shroud of Turin, I think is an exact parallel, and the prophecy there would have been fulfilled in a very significant way.
Well, I can't. I certainly wouldn't argue with you on that. I agree, because if that was what the prophecy said, and if that was the meaning behind it, as you pointed out, then I would say what's on the shroud is consistent with those passages of the gospel. Then.
And you know, the Bible is really, to me, a historical book as well. It's not necessarily just a religious book. Do you agree with that, Barrie?
Well, you know, to an extent I do, George, and in some areas I might not totally agree with that. Look, I said earlier to one of the other questioners that part of what we have to contend with when we discuss the Gospels is the fact that there are interpretations. And I've lectured in churches, and I've heard one passage be interpreted differently than in a different church by, people who are scholarly in that area. So as I think that the general points of history, particularly the description of the crucifixion and all the things that were done to Jesus, I think that we can look at that with some veracity because there's that consistency amongst the different stories in the Gospels.
When we come back, Barrie, let's take some final calls at Coast to Coast AM. Well, next hour, we're going to talk about Yellowstone, that super volcano, with Mitch Batras. And welcome back to Coast. Barrie, what's some of the next research into the Shroud? What's going to happen in the future?
Well, George, at this point in time, it's a tough question to answer because as it stands now, remember we have this upcoming exhibition with the Shroud. The day that the announcement was made by Pope Benedict that he had given permission for them to display it next year, the following day, the Turin Archdiocese released a press release stating that this would be for pastoral purposes only, in other words, only for the faithful. No science would be permitted. So it really rests in the hands of the Turin authorities and the Church, which we didn't really mention earlier, has only owned the Shroud since basically 1985.
Oh, really? I didn't know
That's right.
That.
When King Umberto, the last Duke of Savoy, the deposed monarch of Italy living in Portugal, when he passed away, he left the Shroud to the living Pope in his will. It took 2 years to probate the will. He died in 1983. In 1985, for the first time in its documented history, the Shroud belongs now to the Church.
And I guess they willingly accepted it.
Oh, I don't think they would have even dreamed of rejecting it, remembering that they have been the custodians and the caretakers of the Shroud for about 450, 500 years.
And before we go to final calls, we didn't really talk about the Knights Templars, the protectors of the Shroud.
There was one other thing I wanted to mention myself, George, and at the top of your show, you were reading the news and you brought up the recent, just in the last 2 days, news report that a new shroud had been found in Jerusalem, dated to the 1st century,
yes,
made of wool, and that proved the shroud was a fake. And I really wanted to address that. I know that any of the readers of my website are kind of waiting for me to respond to that.
Absolutely. Sure thing.
I wanted to say this, that first of all, the Mishnah, the sort of the rules that Jewish customs are bound to, in the Mishnah it states that a burial must be in clean linen raiments. It is permitted under Jewish law for the linen to be interwoven with another fabric, in this case wool. I just wanted to point out to people how ludicrous these claims are, that because they found a different kind of shroud, all it really means is that first century Jews could be buried in different kinds of cloths as long as linen was part of their makeup. And I pointed out to someone just today in an email that, when we're buried, we're not all buried in identical caskets. We're not all wearing the same clothing. So just because we find a different type of shroud, it's still consistent with Jewish burial custom. And as I said at the beginning of the show, the linen of the Shroud of Turin would have been a finer cloth than the wool and linen combination that they're describing in the recent news releases. So all I wanted to do was assure people that although they may have found this, by the way, they're claiming this is new, but this was first presented in 2003, 6 years ago. So this isn't really new. It's being pulled out again and dusted off once again, just sort of because there's a public exhibition coming, we have to say something about the Shroud.
Okay,
so I just wanted to address that.
Absolutely. We now go to Fort Worth, Texas. Hello, Kenneth. You're up with us on Coast to Coast.